May 1945. The war in Europe is over. Hitler is gone. The Reich destroyed, yet peace feels hollow. Cities are rubble, millions are homeless, and death camps reveal unspeakable horrors. Soldiers celebrate, but unease lingers. In Berlin, Soviet flags rise as Western eyes watch with doubt. Across the ocean, the atomic age begins. The Allies smile for cameras, yet mistrust grows. The guns are silent, but the world senses a colder, more dangerous struggle ahead. The Cold War is about to begin. 1945 marked the end of one nightmare, but also the birth of another. Nazi Germany was crushed, yet Europe lay in ruins. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, economies collapsed, and tens of millions were left homeless. Camps of horror revealed the depth of Nazi crimes, etching scars into the conscience of humanity. The old empires of Europe were weakened, their colonial grip slipping. In their place, two giants emerged. To the west stood the United States, wealthy, armed with the atomic bomb, and determined to shape a world of democracy and open markets. To the east stood the Soviet Union, victorious through sacrifice, commanding vast armies, and driven by a vision of control and security. They appeared united in victory, but their ambitions could not coexist. The war was over, yet in the fragile silence of 1945, the Cold War was waiting. Germany's defeat left behind not only ruins, but a dangerous emptiness. Entire governments collapsed overnight, transport networks lay shattered, and millions of displaced people searched for food, shelter, and the faint hope of stability. Across Europe, order itself had vanished. Into this void stepped the Allied leaders. At Yalta and Potsdam, they met to shape the future, but their unity was already fragile. The United States pressed for open markets, free elections, and democratic institutions. The Soviet Union, haunted by past invasions and sustained by vast armies, demanded control and security above all else. Between these two visions lay the nations of Eastern Europe, liberated from Nazi tyranny, yet already falling under new chains. In 1945, the lines of the next conflict were being drawn. The alliance that had destroyed Hitler was giving way to suspicion, rivalry, and the first shadows of the Cold War. Berlin, April 1945. The proud heart of Hitler's empire has become a vision of the apocalypse. Streets once lined with parades of triumph are now rivers of rubble. Buildings stand as hollow shells gutted by fire and bombardment. The air itself tastes of smoke, ash, and despair. For the people of Berlin, the war has come home with unimaginable fury. The Red Army pushes into the city with unrelenting force. Stalin has ordered that Berlin must fall, and it must fall to Soviet hands. More than 1 million Soviet troops close in, their artillery turning every district into a wasteland. The fighting is savage, house to house, room to room. Soldiers fire from shattered windows, snipers stalk from rooftops, grenades roll down stairwells. Each street becomes a fortress, each block a graveyard. Tens of thousands of soldiers die in the final weeks, their lives sacrificed for a city already lost. Inside his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler refuses to face reality. He rages against betrayal, condemns his generals, and issues commands to armies that exist only on maps. His world has shrunk to dim corridors and the echo of distant gunfire. On April 30th, as Soviet shells explode above, Hitler takes his own life. The man who promised a 1,000-year Reich leaves behind only ruin and silence. On May 2nd, German defenders in Berlin surrender. Above the ruins, Soviet soldiers scale the shattered Reichstag and raise the red flag over its dome. Captured in a single photograph, the image becomes one of the defining symbols of the century. To the Soviet Union, it is the ultimate proof of victory, of sacrifice repaid in glory. To the West, it is a sign of the new power that now dominates the heart of Europe. Meanwhile, American and British troops advance from the West. Their progress is steady, their reception often joyous, but what they discover in the heart of Germany is beyond comprehension. In April, U.S. forces liberate Buchenwald, Dachau, and countless other camps. The British uncover Bergen-Belsen. Inside the barbed wire they find mountains of corpses, mass graves hastily dug, and survivors who are scarcely alive, skeletons draped in skin, eyes hollow with suffering. Soldiers break down weeping at the sight. The war is revealed not just as a conflict of nations, but as an assault on humanity itself. The liberation of the camps reshapes the moral meaning of victory. On May 7th, in the French city of Rennes, The German High Command signs unconditional surrender to the Western Allies, but Stalin demands his own ceremony. 2 days later, in Berlin, the Germans surrender again, this time to the Soviet Union. Across the world, the announcement brings unparalleled joy. In London, Winston Churchill addresses cheering crowds as church bells echo across the city. In Paris, the streets erupt into a sea of flags and celebration. In New York, Times Square becomes a flood of confetti, dancing, and tears of relief. Families embrace, strangers kiss, and an entire generation dares to imagine peace. The nightmare is over. It is Victory in Europe Day, V-Day, yet beneath the jubilation, tension simmers. The Soviet Union has endured losses almost beyond human imagination. More than 20 million lives extinguished, entire cities like Stalingrad and Leningrad left in ruins. Stalin is determined that never again will Russia be left vulnerable to invasion. His armies remain stationed across Eastern Europe, occupying Poland, Hungary, Romania, and beyond. To Moscow, this is security. To the West, it is domination. The fall of Nazi Germany closed one of history's darkest chapters. Yet in its very end, new shadows began to stretch across Europe. Victory brought peace, but not trust. The Third Reich was gone, but suspicion now stood in its place. The war was over. But the fragile silence of 1945 was already giving birth to another conflict. A war colder, quieter, but no less dangerous. Even as the last battles of World War II raged, the victors turned their eyes to the future. The world had to be rebuilt, and the seeds of peace or conflict were to be planted in the councils of power. The fate of nations rested not only on the battlefield, but around conference tables draped with flags and guarded by suspicion. In February 1945, at the Crimean resort of Yalta, 3 men met, who together carried the burden of the modern world: Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin. They posed for photographers, smiling stiffly, wrapped in heavy coats against the winter air. To the public, it was the image of unity. In truth, mistrust simmered beneath the surface. Each man arrived at Yalta with his own vision of the post-war order. Roosevelt, frail from illness, yet resolute in purpose, sought to create a lasting framework for peace. He envisioned the United Nations, a body that could resolve disputes, prevent future wars, and give smaller nations a voice. Churchill, ever mindful of Britain's dwindling empire, hoped to preserve British influence while also containing Soviet expansion. Stalin, carrying the grief of more than 20 million Soviet dead, demanded above all else security. He would not allow Russia to be invaded again, and he intended to shape Eastern Europe as a fortress under Soviet control. At Yalta, compromises were struck. Germany would be divided into zones of occupation. Berlin, though deep in the Soviet zone, would itself be partitioned. Eastern Europe would hold free elections, at least on paper. Stalin agreed, but with his armies already on the ground. His definition of free was very different from Roosevelt's and Churchill's. Each signed their names, but each left the table with his own interpretation. The cracks of mistrust widened even as the ink dried. By July 1945, the war in Europe was over, and a new gathering was called, this time in Potsdam, a quiet suburb of Berlin. The faces around the table had changed. Roosevelt had died in April, leaving Harry Truman as America's new president. He was less patient than Roosevelt, less inclined to trust Stalin, and more determined that American strength should shape the future. Churchill arrived but was soon replaced mid-conference after losing Britain's election to Clement Attlee, a quiet, unassuming man who suddenly found himself at the center of world history. Stalin remained, confident and unyielding, his armies occupying half of Europe. The mood at Potsdam was colder than at Yalta. The unity of wartime had faded, replaced by tension. Truman, carrying knowledge of a secret weapon tested in the deserts of New Mexico, spoke with newfound authority. The atomic bomb had changed everything. Though he mentioned it only in vague terms, Stalin understood immediately. His face betrayed nothing, but he resolved that the Soviet Union would have such a weapon as well, no matter the cost. In that moment, the nuclear arms race was born. Potsdam dealt with the wreckage of Europe. Germany would be disarmed and demilitarized. Nazi leaders would face justice in trials at Nuremberg. Borders would be redrawn. Poland shifted westward. Millions of Germans forced from ancestral homes in one of the largest migrations in history. To the displaced, it was chaos and misery. To the leaders, it was geopolitics, but the deeper issue was trust, or the lack of it. Promises made at Yalta began to unravel almost immediately. Instead of the free elections that had been pledged, Eastern Europe saw communist governments installed, backed by Soviet troops. Poland, Hungary, Romania all fell swiftly into Moscow's orbit. For Stalin, this was security paid for by Soviet blood. For Truman and Churchill, it was the betrayal of agreements and the first act of domination. In the months that followed, the optimism of Yalta evaporated. The United Nations was created as Roosevelt had dreamed, but it could not hide the growing chasm between East and West. Behind the speeches and signatures lay the reality. The alliance was crumbling. Cooperation gave way to confrontation. Suspicion replaced trust, and every handshake carried the weight of doubt. The conferences of 1945 were meant to secure the peace. Instead, they revealed the fragility of unity. In the drawing rooms of Yalta and Potsdam, the victors carved up the spoils of war, but also carved the lines of division. Europe was no longer one continent. It was already two worlds, staring at each other across a deepening gulf. The war against fascism was over, but the struggle for the future had only just begun. July 16, 1945. In the desert of New Mexico, the night is torn apart by a light that outshines the dawn. The Trinity test has succeeded. A fireball surges upward, a pillar of flame and smoke reaching into the heavens. The blast shatters windows miles away, its heat felt on skin from a distance that seems impossible. Humanity has crossed a threshold. The atomic bomb is real, and the world will never be the same again. For President Harry Truman, the successful test provides a weapon to end the war with Japan and a tool to strengthen America's hand in shaping the future. For the scientists who built it, awe is mixed with dread. They know they have created not just a weapon of victory, but a weapon of annihilation. At Potsdam, Truman carries the secret into negotiations with Joseph Stalin. In casual conversation, he hints at a new and powerful device. Stalin listens with a mask of indifference, but inside he has already resolved. The Soviet Union will not be left behind. His intelligence services are already at work, and his scientists will be ordered to deliver a bomb of their own. A new race has begun, measured not in miles or armies, but in megatons. On August 6, 1945, a lone American bomber flies over Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., a single bomb falls. In a blinding flash, the city vanishes. Tens of thousands die instantly. Buildings are vaporized, and shadows are seared into the ground. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffers the same fate. Nearly 200,000 lives are extinguished in fire and radiation. Within a week, Japan surrenders. The Second World War is over. Across America, relief and celebration erupt. The war that claimed millions of lives has ended without the need for an invasion of Japan. But beneath the relief lies unease. A weapon capable of destroying cities in seconds is now part of human reality. For the first time, mankind holds the power to end its own existence. For Stalin, the message is clear. The Red Army may dominate Eastern Europe, but a single American weapon has rendered traditional armies almost obsolete. The Soviet Union must match this power, or risk being forever vulnerable. The push for a Soviet bomb becomes an obsession, consuming vast resources, carried out in secrecy and with ruthless determination. Meanwhile, the United States turns its attention to Europe's recovery. The Marshall Plan is unveiled, billions in aid to rebuild the economies of Western Europe. To Washington, it is a lifeline of hope and stability, a shield against the spread of communism. To Moscow, it is an act of aggression, an attempt to bind Europe to American influence through money instead of armies. Eastern European states are pressured by Stalin to reject the aid, solidifying the divide. The atomic bomb hovers over every diplomatic move. Its existence shifts the balance of fear, creating a fragile peace built on the threat of mutual destruction. Scientists, horrified by their creation, introduce the world to a haunting symbol, the doomsday clock, its hands inching toward midnight to warn humanity of how close it has come to catastrophe. In March 1946, in Fulton, Missouri, Winston Churchill gives voice to what many already fear. Speaking alongside Truman, he declares, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." The words capture the new reality. Europe is divided into two worlds. On one side, the United States and its allies promise democracy, freedom, and open markets. On the other, the Soviet Union enforces control, obedience, and the spread of communism. The world has entered a new age. No longer is conflict measured solely in soldiers or tanks. but in bombs that can erase entire cities. No longer is peace secured by trust, but by fear of total destruction. The atomic bomb did not just end a war, it defined the shape of the new one. A Cold War, fought not in open battle, but in shadows, suspicion, and the looming threat of nuclear fire. 1945. The guns of war have fallen silent, but across Europe the silence is heavy. It is the silence of shattered cities, of millions without homes, of nations stripped bare by 6 years of destruction. Entire landscapes are unrecognizable. Dresden smolders in ruins. Warsaw lies as a skeleton of stone, and whole stretches of the Soviet Union are nothing but scorched earth. More than 70 million people are dead, and countless more are displaced, living in camps, wandering roads, or searching for loved ones who will never return. The war has ended, but the peace has not yet arrived. Hunger stalks the continent. Railways and bridges lie in ruins, making the delivery of food and coal nearly impossible. Disease spreads in refugee camps. Orphans roam cities with empty eyes, symbols of a continent broken not just in stone, but in spirit. Europe, once the center of the world, now lies prostrate, vulnerable, and dependent on those who have survived the storm with their power intact. Two visions for the future now confront one another. The United States, untouched at home and enriched by the war economy, sees opportunity in rebuilding. To Truman and his advisors, prosperity and democracy must be planted in the ruins, for hunger and despair are fertile ground for extremism. The answer is aid, reconstruction, and the promise of freedom. To the Soviet Union, whose soil has been ravaged by invasion and whose people have sacrificed more than 20 million lives, the priority is security. Stalin insists on friendly governments along his western frontier, nations that will never again serve as corridors for German tanks or Western armies. For Moscow, control means survival. For Washington, it looks like expansion. The fault lines deepen in 1946. Churchill, no longer Britain's prime minister but still its voice, travels to Fulton, Missouri. Standing beside Truman, he declares that an iron curtain has descended across Europe, dividing the continent between East and West. The phrase captures the reality now visible to all. Eastern Europe is locked behind Soviet power. While Western Europe drifts toward America's embrace, the ideological battle begins to shape everyday lives. In the East, communist governments rise in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, backed by the presence of the Red Army. Elections, when held, are carefully managed to ensure communist victory. Opposition parties are silenced, leaders imprisoned or executed. The press becomes an arm of the state, and economies are rebuilt not for profit, but for control. In the West, the United States prepares its boldest answer, the Marshall Plan. Announced in 1947, it offers billions of dollars to rebuild European industry, repair infrastructure, and restore trade. Factories reopen, lights return to darkened cities, and a sense of hope spreads across Western Europe. But this aid is not without strings. To Stalin, it is an economic weapon, a Trojan horse designed to bind Europe to American power. Eastern states are ordered to reject it, deepening the divide. Berlin becomes the first great flashpoint. The city, carved into occupation zones despite lying deep within the Soviet sphere, is a symbol of the continent's future. Cooperation between the Allies frays quickly. Roads and railways are contested. Supplies are restricted, and the people of Berlin become pawns in a struggle between ideologies. The city that Hitler once ruled as his capital is now the front line of a new conflict. Across the Atlantic, Americans debate their new role in the world. Isolation is no longer an option. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine declares that the United States will support free peoples resisting subjugation, whether by armed minorities or outside pressure. It is a promise of global responsibility, a pledge that America will not retreat into its borders. For the first time, the U.S. commits itself to containing communism wherever it appears. The Soviets respond with their own vision. In 1947, the Communist Information Bureau, Cominformis, created to coordinate parties across Europe. Stalin warns of capitalist encirclement, portraying the United States not as liberator, but as imperialist aggressor. Propaganda fills the streets of Eastern Europe, where posters show Uncle Sam as a new conqueror, seeking domination under the guise of aid. By 1948, the tension sharpens into confrontation. In Czechoslovakia, one of the last democracies in Eastern Europe, A communist coup seizes power. Non-communist leaders are forced out, some driven to suicide, and the nation is pulled firmly into the Soviet orbit. To the west, this is proof that Stalin's promises of self-determination were hollow. To the east, it is security secured by necessity. The struggle is not only political but psychological. Fear seeps into daily life. In America, the specter of Soviet espionage sparks suspicion, investigations, and loyalty tests. In the Soviet Union, paranoia fuels purges and surveillance as Stalin tightens his grip on every aspect of society. The Cold War is not yet declared, but it is already felt in every headline, every border crossing, every whispered suspicion. As Europe struggles to rebuild, two irreconcilable systems stare at each other across a continent scarred by war. To one side, democracy and capitalism promise prosperity and freedom. To the other, socialism and state power promise security and equality. Both claim to offer peace, but both prepare for conflict. By the late 1940s, Europe is no longer one continent. It has become two halves of a fractured whole. The ruins of Berlin, Warsaw, and Dresden are not only scars of a past war, but warning signs of the next. The guns of 1945 may have fallen silent, but the drums of a colder, more insidious struggle are already sounding. The battle for Europe's soul has begun, and it will last for generations. By 1947, the uneasy truce that followed Hitler's defeat was collapsing. The handshakes of wartime victory were giving way to clenched fists. The United States and the Soviet Union no longer stood shoulder to shoulder. They now confronted each other as adversaries in a struggle for power, influence, and survival. In March of that year, President Harry Truman addressed Congress with words that echoed across the world. The Truman Doctrine pledged that the United States would support free peoples resisting oppression. Though unstated, it was a declaration of war on communism itself. Greece, locked in civil war, and Turkey, threatened by Soviet pressure, became the first recipients of American aid. Money, weapons, and advisors poured in, marking the beginning of a global commitment. Isolation was finished. America had stepped onto the world stage as the defender of democracy. The policy was soon reinforced by economics as well as arms. In June 1947, Secretary of State George C. Marshall unveiled a sweeping plan to rebuild Europe. Billions of dollars were promised for reconstruction, new factories, working railroads, and revived trade. To the West, this was generosity combined with strategy. Prosperity would prevent extremism. To the East, it was aggression masked as aid. Stalin denounced the Marshall Plan as a capitalist trap, a Trojan horse that would bind nations to Washington. Under pressure, Eastern states rejected the assistance. Europe was being rebuilt, but rebuilt in halves. The ideological clash soon found its battlefield in Berlin. Though buried deep within Soviet territory, the city had been divided among the Allies. In June 1948, Stalin launched his boldest move yet, the Berlin Blockade. All road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin was cut. More than 2 million people were trapped, their survival held hostage. The Allies were faced with a stark choice: withdraw and abandon the city, or risk war. They chose neither. Instead, they launched the Berlin Airlift, a daring gamble to sustain an entire metropolis from the sky. Day and night, planes roared over the city, landing every few minutes with supplies: coal for heat, flour for bread, milk for children, all delivered by air. At the height of the crisis, a plane touched down every 30 seconds. Berliners endured cold winters and shortages, but they endured with defiance. Pilots dropped candy to children waiting below, lifting spirits with sweetness amid hardship. After 11 tense months, Stalin relented. The blockade was lifted. The airlift had proven Western resolve without firing a shot. But the blockade left scars that would never heal. It confirmed to both sides that Europe was divided beyond reconciliation. The West responded with unity. In April 1949, NATO was formed, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. For the first time, America bound itself to Europe in peacetime. An attack on one was an attack on all. The Atlantic was no longer an ocean separating continents, but a bridge uniting allies in common defense. Stalin countered not with alliances, but with science. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The American monopoly on nuclear weapons, assumed to last for decades, had ended in just 4 years. A mushroom cloud rose over the Kazakh steppe, and with it, the world entered a new and perilous balance. No longer could one side dictate by threat alone. Both now held the power of annihilation. The doomsday clock inched closer to midnight. The climax of the post-war years was not a single event, but a chain reaction. The Truman Doctrine declared global resistance to communism. The Marshall Plan rebuilt the West while isolating the East. The Berlin Airlift turned defiance into triumph. NATO forged alliances of iron, and the Soviet bomb shattered America's illusion of invulnerability. Together, these moments transformed suspicion into open hostility, mistrust into rivalry, rivalry into confrontation. By the end of the 1940s, the world was no longer healing from war. It was preparing for another kind of struggle. The allies of yesterday had become the adversaries of today. Two superpowers stood armed, staring across Europe, their visions of the future locked in opposition. Neither would yield, neither could afford to lose, and above them both hung the shadow of the mushroom cloud, the terrible symbol that the next war might not merely change nations, but end civilization itself. The turning point had been reached. The Cold War was no longer an emerging fear. It was now an undeniable reality. The first years after 1945 were meant to bring peace, yet they forged the shape of a new conflict that would last for generations. The world stood victorious over fascism, but beneath the celebrations, the alliances of war hardened into blocks of rivalry. The peace of 1945 was fragile, and in its cracks the Cold War was born. Europe was now a continent divided. In the West, the Marshall Plan poured billions of dollars into rebuilding economies, reviving factories, and restoring hope. Cities that had been reduced to rubble lit up again with electricity, and trade routes reopened. Western Europe, though weakened, began to stand on its feet with American support. In the East, the Soviet Union imposed its model: nationalization of industries, centralized planning, and communist governments backed by Moscow's military power. The divide was no longer just military or political. It was economic, social, and ideological. Germany became the most visible symbol of this division. In 1949, the Western Allies merged their zones into the Federal Republic of Germany, a democratic state aligned with the West. In response, Stalin created the German Democratic Republic in the East, a communist state under Soviet control. One nation, one people split in two. Berlin, carved into halves, stood as the front line of the new struggle, a city where East and West confronted one another every day. Beyond Europe, the world itself was reshaped. The Truman Doctrine had pledged American support against communism anywhere on the globe. The Soviet Union, in turn, portrayed itself as the champion of anti-colonial struggles, supporting movements in Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. The battle lines of ideology stretched across continents, and nations newly freed from colonial rule soon found themselves courted or pressured by one side or the other. The atomic bomb loomed over all of this. With the Soviet Union's successful test in 1949, the balance of fear became permanent. The world now lived under the shadow of mutual destruction. Military strategy, diplomacy, even culture itself became shaped by the knowledge that another world war could mean the end of civilization. Scientists, politicians, and citizens alike wrestled with the terrifying reality of the nuclear age. The early Cold War years also left a legacy of institutions and alliances that would define the decades ahead. NATO bound the West together in mutual defense, while in response, the Soviets would soon form their own military alliance in the East. The United Nations, conceived in hope, found itself paralyzed by superpower rivalry, its Security Council a stage for vetoes and propaganda. The optimism of 1945 gave way to a world of suspicion, division, and constant vigilance. For the millions of ordinary people living through these years, the legacy was not only political but personal. Families were divided by new borders, letters censored, travel restricted. In Eastern Europe, dissent was silenced, while in the West, fear of infiltration bred suspicion and loyalty tests. Children grew up practicing air raid drills, while parents stocked cellars in case of nuclear attack. The Cold War was not fought on battlefields alone. It was felt in the hearts and minds of entire populations. History remembers 1945 as the year victory was achieved, but it also remembers it as the year a new confrontation began, one defined not by open war, but by competition, fear, and ideology. The Allies who once fought shoulder to shoulder against Hitler now stared at one another across barbed wire and divided cities. The legacy of 1945 was not only liberation, it was division. Not only triumph, it was tension. The war had ended, but its shadow lingered. And from that shadow emerged a new world order, one where the fate of nations and the survival of humanity itself would hang in the balance of a Cold War. The story of 1945 is often told as a tale of victory. The guns fell silent, the swastika was torn down, and the world emerged from the most destructive war in human history. But history is never so simple. Victory did not bring lasting unity. Instead, it revealed deep fractures, political, ideological, and human, that reshaped the destiny of nations. The end of the war promised freedom, yet it also brought division. The liberation of Eastern Europe gave way to Soviet control. The promises of free elections, signed at Yalta, dissolved into censorship, one-party rule, and fear. In the West, prosperity returned under American protection, but so too did suspicion, anxieties about infiltration, betrayal, and nuclear annihilation. The post-war world was not a world at peace. It was a world on edge. The Cold War that followed was not declared with speeches or signed with treaties. It emerged quietly, from mistrust too deep to bridge, from ambitions too large to share. It was fought in the rubble of Berlin, in the parliaments of Europe, and in the laboratories where scientists raced to perfect weapons of unimaginable power. It was fought in propaganda posters, in whispered suspicions, and in the tense stares of soldiers across barbed wire. It was a war without fronts, but with consequences felt everywhere. And yet, beneath the rivalry and fear, there was also resilience. Cities rebuilt, families endured. Generations of children grew up under the shadow of the mushroom cloud, yet still dreamed of a future beyond division. The Cold War shaped politics and culture, science and strategy, but it never erased the human longing for peace. Looking back, 1945 stands as both an ending and a beginning. The end of fascism, the end of Hitler's empire, the end of a war that claimed millions. But also the beginning of a new struggle, one that would dominate the second half of the 20th century. From that fragile silence of 1945 rose two superpowers, two visions of humanity's future, and a conflict that would stretch from Europe to Asia, from the nuclear arms race to the space race, from the streets of Berlin to the jungles of Vietnam. This was the legacy of 1945, triumph shadowed by fear, unity replaced with rivalry, peace haunted by the threat of annihilation. It reminds us that victory does not end history. It only changes its direction. As we reflect on these years, we see how choices made in the ruins of war echo across generations. The Cold War would go on to shape alliances, revolutions, and confrontations for decades. And it all began in the ashes of 1945, when one world ended and another, colder world was born.